I follow a great Instagram account called, I think it's called Tech Roast Show, and you guys should follow it. And I feel like, this guy, look at this guy's face. He follows it. I feel like, Chirpo, you need to get in on that. They do a show where they bring developers up on stage and roast them, and it's absolutely amazing. So that's my first tip, completely unrelated to the talk. Yes. Actually, before I get into the talk, I will introduce it, but I actually wanted to start my talk actually with a story, if I may. So I used to work for a company, basically a local government company, provided services to people, basically constituents in sort of local government. New company, new founded startup company. And essentially my first task when I joined that company was to basically build their front-end application, build out a landing page, and deploy that. So basically what we did is we took our stuff, bundled it in Docker. We had a Docker file that looked like that, maybe a little bit more complicated. And our developer experience was basically Docker build, push, stuff was in production. That was our developer experience loop. Sweet, everything was great. And then once we sort of deployed some of the front end, landing page stuff, eventually we started getting some customers on board, and things really started taking off. Like the company was growing, we started hiring new people and things like that. So what we started doing is breaking down our Docker files, right? So breaking out, I think we've talked about this before. I think the last talk talked about this path where we start breaking stuff down into microservices, containerizing bits and pieces of the application. Again, this isn't the exact Docker compose, but it looks quite like this, where we broke down our individual Docker files. And then at some point, we then started looking into Kubernetes, right? As the company started growing, as the number of engineers we started onboarding, we wanted more complexity and more flexibility in our application. So we brought in Kubernetes and started to build out on top of that. And then we started then essentially migrating a lot of our configurations into Kubernetes manifest files. Now I'm just curious in terms of the room, like how many people is that like, this makes sense to them by show of hands? Like, okay, so maybe 20% of the room. Okay, so for the folks that are not the Kubernetes folks, this is kind of like your Docker Compose. It's how Kubernetes reads your configurations inside of Kubernetes. There's many different flavors of it, but it kind of boils down to this. So think about just like Docker Compose or Docker configs, but for Kubernetes. But that's when we started having lots of issues. And we started having lots of outages. And one of the sources of a lot of these incidents was really the fact that our Kubernetes configurations that we had were starting to drift and became very different from our local configuration. So our Docker Compose configuration, our ports, our volumes, our networking looked very different from the Kubernetes configurations themselves. And the situation that we found ourselves in at the time is the same situation that I speak to when I speak to a lot of customers for the company that I work for and lots of people in the community. And I've lovingly and affectionately named this challenge the Chasm of Doom. Now, I'll come back to the Chasm of Doom and explain that in just a sec, but I will introduce myself first. So, my name's Lou. I am a product manager, as Chirpo mentioned. I've gone to the dark side. I might come back. But I was previously a platform engineer, and then before that also a software engineer. And I think actually through those experiences, it's given me a sort of a unique perspective, I suppose, on the industry as a whole, being a developer, moving into platform, and then also doing things on the product side as well. So what I want to share with you today is a discussion where we'll talk about inner and outer loop of developer experience and how that's shifting and how that might impact things in the future. So, back to the Chasm of Doom. What is this? So I had to go actually turning essentially what is the Chasm of Doom, in my opinion, into a meme, which I'm going to break down for you now. And I think this meme actually articulates it perfectly. What we often have is on the left side of the Chasm of Doom is like our local configurations. It's Docker, it's Docker Compose, maybe it's even Minikube, something we run on our machine to try and replicate our Kubernetes installation. Now on the other side of the equation, we often get sort of platform engineers, because Kubernetes is complicated. It's not often the same person that's actually touching the Kubernetes configuration files. Maybe it's someone in platform or some SRE or infrastructure cloud people. But what that leaves is this gap that can emerge for our developer experience in the middle, which I have called the Chasm of Doom. How do you know if you're in the Chasm of Doom? Well, it typically looks like this. You maybe can't replicate things locally, so you push things into your CI pipeline, and maybe you wait 30 minutes, 60 minutes in order to get a feedback loop and actually view your change, because you can't run stuff locally. So my networking is different in production, so I have to change it here, push it through CI, and that's the place you're in. That's your developer experience now, is just staring at CI, waiting for it to finish. And often what this results in as well, like if you're in a platform team, you end up overburdened because no one really understands the Kubernetes installation, so they're running to you if something breaks. If they need to spin up a cluster to test on, that can be really challenging as well. And the core issue underneath all of this is this fundamental idea that actually abstracting applications from infrastructure is really difficult. I think we came up with Docker and containerization, but we're not there yet. We're definitely not there yet at all. Applications and infrastructure are interwoven. They're very much connected. It's very hard to run an application or replicate that, let's say, on our machines in a way that's representative of our production environment. So that's what we run, separate from where it runs. And then from a developer experience side, our application development loop looks like a compiler, right? We build things, we get an instant feedback loop, maybe we run some unit tests. But then when we run our infrastructure, we kind of step into this different world. Once we've committed our code, we now find ourselves running around in AWS or in GCP, filtering through logs. And it's a different kind of development loop, it's a different kind of developer experience. And for those of you that have been in the developer experience world for a little bit, you've probably heard of these phrases as well, which is inner loop and outer loop. Now those both basically mean inner loop is usually everything happens pre-commit. All of your developer experience typically happens in your editor, your builds, things like that before you commit. Then when you commit, CI pipelines, Kubernetes, cloud, your monitoring tools, things like that. And yeah, you often see it represented like this. So here are your tools for the inner and the outer loop. And just like with this chasm of doom, the challenge though is that those can start to drift over time. Our tools that we're using in production can end up differing from the tools that we use locally, especially when our remote tools like AWS or Kubernetes become more complicated. There's more stuff that's interwoven into our remote tools as well. Now, for some of you, 20% of you had seen the Kubernetes manifest file. For the 80%, maybe you're, I'm not using Kubernetes, like, we're not doing that. This doesn't apply to me. But I see this as well in different tech stacks. So I made a new meme for the serverless, which is basically the same meme. It's the same problem, but in a different space. And that's basically we take your local running tools for serverless stack, for serverless as an application stack. We might have NPM or local stack for mocking or serverless framework. But then again, that stuff eventually does run in our outer loop, in our cloud environment, Lambda, DynamoDB, this kind of thing. And if we're not careful, if we're not diligent about it, we end up back in the chasm of doom, but just in serverless this time, rather than Kubernetes. And it's the same manifestation. It's these build, sort of pushing and waiting cycles where we sit staring at CI. And you need a PhD in AWS sometimes as well. I had posted about this on Twitter like 2 days ago, and people were very mad about this topic. But the thing is, for the serverless folks, you need to know a lot. The same for Kubernetes. These are complicated tech stacks. They're quite difficult. So I suppose in a perfect world, our inner and outer loop looks like this. We write our applications, we write our unit tests, and that flows into production. But I think it rarely looks like that. That's like a very calm representation I see in books that doesn't feel representative of my reality anyway. For me, it feels more like this, where like you pull stuff down from GitHub, you make some changes, you push it up to Kubernetes. Oh no, my integration with my Amazon or my cloud account doesn't work. Now I need to push things through CI, run things again, get things into production, and you're all over the place. And I think actually now the inner and the outer loop within our developer experience is blurring more than ever before. Things that we do remotely, we also need to be able to do locally as well. And one other observation I've started to make, especially when I talk to platform teams specifically, is that a lot of platform teams have a lot of ownership over the outer loop. So the cloud platform, CI pipelines, stuff like that. So we tend to bias that way. We tend to spend a lot of our time optimizing essentially the outer loop, which is challenging. But we typically haven't spent a lot of time optimizing the inner loop. And what I think is sometimes if you come at developer experience from these two frameworks of like kind of inner and outer loop, when developers are kind of in charge of their own experience, they start picking tools like serverless framework or serverless stack. And these frameworks are often based in languages and things like that. But when it's sort of on the platform side, it might be Kubernetes, or it might be cross-plane, or it might be Backstage, things like that. But then we end up with these two different worlds that are a little bit separate, which is how we can end up with this drift. But one thing I want to show you, and I want to show you a couple of demos today, because I actually feel like there are ways that we can start to bridge this, and we can start to not treat the inner and the outer loop as separate, but we start to treat them as the same. How can we bring those two worlds together? It might sound abstract, but I'm going to show you some demos of how some different tools and patterns are doing this in the real world today, and then maybe it gives us an idea of where maybe the future is going and what we can do. So, I picked a couple of different tools to show you, because they show different aspects of this. The first one is Tilt, the second one is Wing, and the final one is the company I work for, Gitpod. Now, just by show of hands, how many people are aware of Tilt, let's say? Okay, so we got like 3, 4, okay, cool, so it's going to be new to you, that's good. What about Winglang? Anyone come across Wing? Oh, I think we have 0. Do we have 1? Okay, cool, everyone's going to learn something today, that's great. And then what about Gitpod, actually? That's a good question. Okay, so we've got maybe 20% of the room, sweet. Now, the thing that ties these all together, and when we get back to it, is we'll see that the common vision across all these tools is trying to get developers actually back to their editor. So getting them out of cloud consoles, out of different interface and CIs, and getting us back into that dev loop that we have on our machine, getting us back into our editor. So I'll start off with Tilt, and I'll have a go doing some live demos. Let's see how this goes. I'm going to run both of these inside of Gitpod, but I'll talk about Gitpod at the end, because hopefully it actually doesn't get in the way. So let me just fire up my little Tilt demo. And actually, I was thinking at the same time, I will fire up my Wing one as well. Cool. So 2 different ways of firing up workspaces there in Gitpod. I'm going to do one through the browser and one through the CLI. But what this is essentially doing, and let me make this a little bit bigger, is this going to hopefully launch and install Tilt for me. Okay, nice. It's trying to open everything all at once, but that's good. At least stuff is open. Cool, so Tilt, what is Tilt? Let me go back to my slide for 1 second. So you can think of Tilt really as kind of like hot reload or file syncing for Kubernetes. Just like, with a web framework that you've got, like React or whatever, like you write your code, you go to the browser, stuff reloads. I think like front-end developers have got it right. They really have tight feedback loops. But as soon as we touch anything with infrastructure, for some reason we just like tolerate this very strong sort of outer loop, pushing things into the CI pipeline. And Tilt directly addresses that issue, specifically for Kubernetes and container-based workloads. So if you're using anything that's based on Kubernetes, and probably actually maybe even some other stuff they have integrated there as well. But let me show you how that looks. So inside my code, let me show you the code first. This theme is kind of ugly, actually. Let me just change the theme. Cool. People are grateful for the dark theme. Cool. So let's have a look at my Tilt file. So my Tilt file is actually very simple. I don't do much in here. Now, in this example, I'm going to connect this up to Docker Compose, and I'll show you with Docker Compose. But actually, the dev experience when you connect up to Kubernetes is very, very similar. It's almost the same. Like, it doesn't really look too much different. And what you do is you basically point Tilt to your configuration files locally. Like in this case, I'm pointing to Docker Compose, and I'm also telling it that I have this microservice application here. Very, very simple repo, as simple as I can make it. And in that, we have a Docker file. So what Tilt gives me is essentially this nice UI. Yeah, sure, you can have telemetry. It gives me this nice UI where I can see my running microservices. And this actually blends as well remote and local microservices. So if I got stuff running Docker Compose locally, that will work. If I'm running a Kubernetes cluster with, 50 different applications, it will also pull that into the exact same UI and the exact same experience as well. So if I drop in here and have a look at my microservice, essentially I get this nice little UI and I see my different Docker logs. But if I go back into my application and I just make a small change, let's say, let's have a look. What should we put? So I'm just going to make a simple change here. Cool, so when I save that, Tilt automatically is now actually running a file watcher on top of my application. It's now going to run the Docker build for me. It's actually then going to essentially then start it running. So in this case, I have skipped over a few different steps. I've skipped over Docker build, I've skipped over sort of building my application, and then if I go to see my running application actually, which I don't think I have open. So let's just open that up actually. I'll have to make another change now so you can see it. I think this is my application, cool. So let's make another change so we see it as well. Cool. So if I go back into my code, go back in here, I make my change, here dxday, change 2, hit save, go back. That's going to take a couple of seconds for Tilt to recognize that. Now it's updating, and then eventually, once it runs my Docker build, it's going to have that deployed for me as well. Now this, oh, I thought it was going to error there for a second. So this same dev experience also works with Kubernetes. So what it can do is hot reload a pod, let's say, running on a remote cluster if you wanted to. Now, it's not as painful when you're running Docker Compose locally, but it gets really painful when you're using Kubernetes remotely, for instance, because it's not just Docker build, Docker push, but it's also then you have to deploy, you have to figure out where do I kubectl apply my manifest files, do I have to run some CI pipeline for that? And then I go back in, cool, my application is reloaded. The thing that I find really curious about this as a developer experience is it starts to blur these lines between this sort of local and remote and this inner and outer loop. Essentially, we're applying this very sort of inner loop type of experience, but also we can apply it to the outer loop. So that's Tilt, but one thing about Tilt, I suppose, is it's kind of like it's putting itself into our existing tools and ecosystem. So let me show you how Wing works as well, because Wing actually comes at this almost from first principles at the language level and actually starts to tackle this in a slightly different but also interesting way. So hopefully my workspace is up, and I'm going to, wait, hold on. My playground has gone. I just need to grab some AWS keys for this as well. But because I'm doing this publicly, this is, I'm going to grab these from my playground actually as well. So let me just paste those in. Let's run this in US East 1. And then wait for that to run. So what is Wing? How does Wing work? Wing is essentially a programming language for the cloud, and it was created by the folks that made AWS CDK. But there's one problem with the AWS CDK that they wanted to fix, and that's the fact that it never bridged the application infrastructure divide, which is kind of like what we talked about earlier on today. So, okay, this is my application. It's now running, hopefully. So let me zoom in and show you what Wing looks like. So this is Wing. If you've seen the Amazon CDK, you might look kind of familiar, because it kind of is. The CDK basically is a SDK or a tool chain on top of Amazon infrastructure. So you can write Amazon infrastructure as code in application programming. Wing takes it one step further, and it allows you to define infrastructure and applications in the exact same programming language. So what we can see here is basically I'm creating an application that consists of a bucket, a counter, and a queue. And then I have this second function down here, which has a callback in it, and you see this little in-flight keyword. So Wing has this idea of in-flight and pre-flight. Pre-flight is all of the things that are typically your infrastructure, so stuff that you typically might do through Terraform or on Kubernetes, let's say. But then your in-flight stuff is like your applications, like your containers, or the stuff that you might deploy onto a Lambda function. But Wing does that all in one place. So it seems a bit abstract, but under the hood, this is building out both our applications and infrastructure. And let's go ahead and actually run some commands so you can see how this works. So let me just open up my little Wing portal as well. I think it should be running on, okay. So Wing, like Tilt, also gives you this nice little console as well, so you can actually have a nice little graphical user interface. You don't need to use it, you can use the CLI, but it's quite cool as well. So I've got my infrastructure here and my application defined as one. So if I go in here and go to this queue, let me just make this bigger actually, move this across. So I've got this queue tied up to a bucket, and also I have this little counter here. So I go into my queue, if I push a message in here, so I say, hey, dxday, push that message. That's actually going to run my logic, and then it's going to take that message and it's going to insert into this bucket. A bucket might be like an S3 bucket or something in your cloud account. Now you might be looking at that and go, okay, cool, looks great, but isn't this just mocking stuff under the hood? And actually no, so let me show you how that works. I just need to grab my workspace. which one is it? It's this one, wing. Cool. Now, I can't remember these commands off the top of my head, so I am going to copy them. So the wing it command basically spins up that console that you've just seen so we can play around. But what we saw essentially there was this definition of this infrastructure in this application. So, but how does that end up inside of, let's say, our cloud account? So what we do is we actually then compile that down and we give it a target. In this case, we give it a target of outputting Terraform and AWS. So let's go ahead and actually run that. And that's going to compile that application down. It's going to create me this little target repo over here. And if I go in there, we basically see Terraform. This is Terraform infrastructure as code. I think the guys are working on HCL support as well. But basically, you could take that, you can run Terraform apply on top of that JSON, and it's going to create you that infrastructure and the application. So you don't have to worry about setting up like uploading application code into an S3 bucket or where that's deployed. It just handles all of that for you transparently. Let me just go back to my README. But then the interesting thing, once we start to flatten the idea of application infrastructure together, is we can also start to apply unit tests that are also integration tests. They're actually both. So let's take a look at these couple of different tests down here as well. So we have one that tests that our bucket actually starts empty. And bear in mind as well that the bucket is like infrastructure. So that starts off empty, and then you're going to put stuff into that bucket, and then you're going to check that the bucket now contains it. So that's cool. It's actually checking our business logic here that's running on top of our infrastructure. So let's run a test on that and see how that looks. So we can actually run it. And this is kind of like a unit test, essentially, that's running across both application and infrastructure. But again, you might be looking at this and saying, okay, cool, this is obviously doing some voodoo magic with some weird mocking. Is this using local stack under the hood? What's going on here? But then the cool thing is, actually, there is a convenience function as well for the test, which basically will take that now. It will take that infrastructure that I just created. It's now going to run that through Terraform. It's literally applying this into AWS as we speak. It's then going to apply those tests, like their integration tests, on the actual running infrastructure, not mocked infrastructure on AWS infrastructure according to our definition, and then it's going to run our tests. Now, I'm not sure how long this takes. I think it might take about 20 or 30 seconds or so. So I might come back to that once that's run. Let me just jump back into my presentation for a second. So one of the founders of Winglang, basically, this is one of the quotes that I pulled out from this podcast. That's actually great. If you're interested in Wing as well, like go and have a look at that. But mentioning basically with the CDK, they didn't manage to encapsulate both applications and infrastructure. So like, how do you put these two together and build an experience that juggles across both? Let's see if okay, cool. So Terraform apply. It's now actually running our tests on our running infrastructure. Tests are now passing, and then it's going to tear that down as well, delete it, and everything's done for me. We'll assume that this is going to complete. So, and then the final one in there actually was Gitpod, which we used as we went through. So I launched both of those workspaces, the things that we wrote our code actually remotely in the cloud. And the way that Gitpod does that is trying to transparently give you a developer experience where you don't notice if anything is running in the cloud at all. So you saw we edited in VS Code, but none of that code was on this laptop here. It's off in the cloud itself. All that workload, the tests that we ran, everything that we did was also in the cloud as well. And one thing that gets me the most excited about things like Gitpod and tools, cloud development environments is when we think about this sort of sphere of influence of platform teams being very outer loop focused, is we can shift that left. We can actually give platform and developer teams the ability to collaborate all the way at the start of their sort of software development lifecycle, right on development. And this is something that we haven't really had before, the ability to configure and automate our environments starting with essentially our development environments, our local machines. It's not something that's been traditionally available. Something that we've seen in big tech companies, Uber, Shopify. A lot of these companies have built their own cloud development environments, but they're expensive and difficult to build, and they haven't been sort of universally available, but they actually now are. Now, oh, sorry, can I play this GIF? Or will it just stop playing? It won't, okay. We'll ignore the GIF for now. But yes, coming back to this previous diagram, through those different technologies that I showed you, through Tilt, through Winglang, and even through Gitpod, I think what we can do is we can start to address this. Rather than treating the inner loop and the outer loop as separate problems, if we start to look at both of them together, we can build developer experiences that start us from when we actually go to write code all the way through to running in production without having to think of these as separate areas. We start to combine both the inner and the outer loop. And what the goal here, I think, the common thread, even those tools are different, is they're trying to put you back into that inner loop. They're trying to put you back into your compiler, back into your IDE, back into the place where you've got this fast feedback loop, and you're not like running through the wildness of your sort of cloud and infrastructure. Now, if you want to, there's actually a whole bunch of other tools that I wanted to demo, but I don't have enough time. So these are some other tools, frameworks. If you want to take a look later, you can do. That I also wanted to dig into. So if you think these ideas are cool, I would definitely go check some of those out as well. What we've got is like Score, which is a standard that's trying to unify across application infrastructure. Shuttle is like a Rust implementation almost of very similar ideas to Wing. And then a lot of others that are crossing this infrastructure and application divide. But yes, just to sort of conclude, what time am I on as well? I have plenty of time for questions, is really that, yeah, I think ultimately to end up building great developer experiences, we have to go beyond this thinking where we separate inner and outer loop, especially if we have platform teams as well that are often very biased to the outer loop side of our software development. We have to collaborate with those platform teams. Very often platform teams are silos. They're like the grumpy people we have to raise a ticket with, which is not actually supposed to be what platform was supposed to be. We want to be able to integrate those tools into our development experience as well. And then ultimately, the thing here that underlies all of this is we should really be looking to meet developers where they're at. And what I mean by that is, let's integrate our tools and experience where developers actually are, so within their editors and things like that. It was a great point, I think, towards the end of the Backstage talk. These folks are saying, like, Backstage is not the place where you do this stuff. It's not necessarily the source of truth that lives elsewhere. So then that means that we can build our developer experience, and then tools like Backstage can surface different aspects of this developer experience. But we can go and look at what our developers are doing today and try to improve their experience where they are, sort of in the editors as well. So a bit of a whirlwind, run through some sort of up-and-coming tools and cloud development environments and things like that. But we've got plenty of time for questions, but I know that I'm the guy that's standing between you and lunch, so we'll see if we get questions or not. But otherwise, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. How was it?
I don't know, where were you?
Sorry, I had to go to the loo.
Okay.
Sorry. Any questions for Lou?
I've bamboozled everyone.
I'm shy, so I try to go last. So, great talk, thank you. I mean, you were showing the developer experience.
Yes.
That is what we are talking about. That's great. Something also crucial for tools like this, for every developer tool, is also the onboarding journey.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, I mean, the developer experience is simple and is offloading all the complexity of the developing on your laptop to somewhere that you don't care anymore as a developer. What is the onboarding journey of Gitpod, and how companies are adopting, and what are the suggestions and the guidance in adopting tools like this? Is it something transparent? Is it something that is instead landing more on the platform team engineering to do a lot of stuff? I mean, what is the onboarding journey for companies like this?
Cool, I can answer that one. I didn't show you, so actually I can just quickly show you, because both of these demos that I did today actually did use Gitpod as well. And they've got a very simple example. So the way that Gitpod works is you codify all of your setup steps for your development environment. And we do that in a Gitpod YAML file. So in the case of Wing, it was very simple. I just ran an installation shell script, installed Winglang, and then started the Wing application. That's how Gitpod works, and you can apply that to your different applications. That's a simple example, but it does get more complex. Like if you have Docker Compose, you have microservices, let's say, you can have different forks in that. So coming to your question of onboarding, onboarding is like a big use case, I think, for a lot of our customers. They want to improve their onboarding. A lot of development environments get very complex. This is a very simple example. More real-world examples, thousands of lines long, it's not usually this simple. But it's complexities like, let's say, integrating into secrets management, getting access to tokens to access a certain system. I ran Winglang that was connected up to AWS. Now you can actually configure Gitpod as well to automatically, the workload itself, the environment can have your secrets loaded in there and the developer doesn't do anything. So coming back to your question about onboarding, I think there's two parts of onboarding. And onboarding is not just when you join a company, right? Sometimes if you change teams or the sort of fluidity within a company. Now I think Backstage is actually really, really good at discovery. So you come in, which team am I on? What services do I own? And that's actually great. I think Gitpod, cloud development environments, and portals are a great mix for that reason. But then when it comes to then starting your application, let's say you go and you find a service, and you're, okay, cool, I've got my ticket, I've got my bug fix. That's where then Gitpod comes in for you, because then you can launch workspaces, and you can just, like I did today, I literally clicked a button, I ran one command, and I'm in my development environment, and everything's configured, and I can start to essentially write my code. So it's two parts, I think. There's that portal part, which is where you discover all the services and things that you own. And then there's the other part, which is the development environment, which is codifying all the things that you need. We call it being ready to code. The idea being that you're literally, the code's there in front of you, you're authenticated, all the tools are installed, and you're ready to go. And that's how it then ultimately impacts then the onboarding experience. There was multiple questions inside your question, which I'll answer the final one, which is, I suppose you asked, like, how do people adopt this, or that was kind of the question? Yeah. Yes. The same with Backstage. I really strongly advise like our customers to also start small with this type of technology. I don't know why. I think we're very ambitious people as developers. We want to take on the world and solve all the challenges. We see that also with Gitpod is companies take it on board and they try and like, oh, let's put this everywhere. All developers will get excited about this. And what we actually advise is no, try and start small. Try and get like one team up and running with this workflow, get it working really well. And this is the natural sort of flow of, I think, of a platform team. You collaborate strongly with, let's say, your internal platform services, codify all of that, get that working. And once you've got that use case of that working really well for that one team, it makes it much easier to roll out. I think it's another thing developers often forget is that we need to build business cases for the tools that we use. So if you do that with a team, you can build a really strong business case, like here's the impact that this is having. And rather than going out there saying, cool, let's use this new tool, you're saying, here is literally the time saved, or here is literally the benefits that using this tool has brought to the company, if that makes sense. So that's how we tend to see this being the most successful, is through that pattern. The one exception is if they have a similar tool, because then usually they have a maturity where they can run through that process a lot faster if they're replacing a homegrown similar solution.
Cool. Oh, there's another question.
I hope a quick question. Hi, thank you for the talk. Maybe a silly question, but could you use Gitpod for legacy environments? And with legacy, I mean stuff that only runs on Windows and you need a special way, an old .NET version or something like that.
Do you, so there's two questions here. Do you mean the application itself, or as in like, can you use Gitpod on that as a operating system?
I would
Or
like
both?
to have a cloud environment that I could use to work on such software.
Okay, yes. So the way Gitpod works right now, and this might change in the future, is the environments themselves are based on Linux. So if you can install it in Linux, like in a Linux VM or a Linux container, you can run it inside of Gitpod. That tends to be what we sort of recommend. We don't have like sort of Windows support right now, but we might do in future if that's something that's essential for you for the operating system. But if you're doing it on Mac or Linux, things like that, yeah, 100%, it works inside of Gitpod. So
Thank you.
Cool. Any other question for Lou? Well, oh, sorry, I didn't see you.
Hi. Again, thanks for the great talk. And I'm interested into how potentially add data, so stateful data to this application. So for instance, in the example, there was an S3 bucket. What about, for instance, an RDS cluster in this life cycle? Which is your recommendation, or how to deal with databases, for instance, in order to, let's say, match local development and...
yes. Do you mean with Wing? Because I showed you two things. Do you mean with Wing, the library I showed you, or with Gitpod?
Yeah,
which
for
is,
instance, if running the test,
Sure.
if in the pre-flight state,
Yes.
phase, sorry, I need to wait for the RDS cluster. It means I need to have a coffee and then come back and see how it goes. So, which is the best recommendation you can provide in these kind of use cases?
This is a great question and one that
Thanks.
I don't have the answer to actually.
Sorry.
I say that because I don't know about Wing specifically. I work obviously for a different company. I essentially don't know for Wing specifically, but I can ask them and I'll get back to you if you want.
Thank you. Any other question? Okay. Round of
We have one question.
Where is it? I can't see it. Oh, okay. Sorry.
I like just to know if when you develop something locally like a query that usually runs on a smaller database than in production, is it possible with this system to able to check what the actual impact has that query in production mode?
I have the same question. Is this in Wing?
Yes. Yes.
I feel like next time I should bring a Wing
what
founder
would be
with me, right?
best for you?
If this is in Wing, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with all the intricacies. Is that the question was related to Wing as in this this program?
Yes, when you basically
Yeah,
deploy that on the AWS, for example.
yes, it's not something I can answer or speak to.
Cool. Any other question not on Wing?
I can answer some about Wing, but these are really hard questions, which I should have anticipated.
Yeah, okay. Cool. Thanks again, Dan Lou. Round of applause.